province in the Republic of South Vietnam. Of course, most days in the summer in the Republic of South Vietnam were quite hot. But in this small province, just northwest of Saigon, the 2nd and 28th Infantry Battalion of the 1st Infantry Division was feeling the heat not just from the sun, but from a day's worth of action against the Viet Cong. Charlie Company, the 2nd and 28th in particular, had taken the brunt of the battle that day, and they were running low on ammunition. So the battalion command asked the recon platoon of the 2nd and 28th, what in today's Army we would call the scout platoon, to take some ammunition out to those guys to make sure that Charlie Company had what they need to make it through the night. The boys from the recon platoon were able to link up with the S4 supply officer. They got the ammunition, and they started on their way to Charlie Company's last known position. Unfortunately, as they were moving along at the edge of a rice paddy, they started to take fire from the tree line. Like any good infantry soldier, they immediately took cover and returned fire. Shortly thereafter, they moved into a trench, probably a dry canal that was used to irrigate the rice paddies there, so that they could have a more cover and concealed position. What they unfortunately did not know was that the Viet Cong had emplaced and well camouflaged a heavy machine gun on the edge of that trench. When it opened up, it had an absolute clear field of fire all the way down. And in just a few moments, it was all over, and the 16 men that made up the recon platoon of the 2nd and 28th Infantry Battalion that day were dead. The Viet Cong took their equipment, stripped their bodies, and left them in the jungle, where the bodies bloated and blackened for about a day and a half before they were found. That day, the price of liberty became very clear to my family. The platoon leader, or the former platoon leader of the recon platoon, the 2nd and 28th Infantry Battalion, was my dad, First Lieutenant Alan Dunn. A couple of weeks before this incident, he had been moved to Alpha Company to be the executive officer. But because on that day, all the dog tags were gone from the soldiers, they had to bring in my dad, one of the few veterans of the recon platoon, to identify the bodies. My dad's never forgotten that day going into the dark of that tent that was used as a makeshift morgue. The stench of the bodies, the heat of the sun, and having to identify those guys he had trained with at Fort Riley in Kansas, that he had come to Vietnam with, and that he had served with for months prior to this tragedy. Almost 40 years later, on March 26, 2005, the price of liberty became very clear to me. On that day, I was in Afghanistan serving on an embedded training team. Myself and a sergeant worked with a company of infantry soldiers of the Afghan National Army. Our task force, which was called Phoenix 3, had sent a member or an element of its headquarters out on a mission that day. We didn't have many Humvees in country at that time, so when we had to go long distances and it was too far to travel on foot, we rode in essentially four-door Ford Ranger pickup trucks. One of those trucks that day struck what we called a double stack, which was two Soviet TC-6 anti-tank mines stacked one on top of the other. Since these weapons were designed to destroy armored vehicles, when the tire of that Ranger hit it, the damage was catastrophic. Captain Michael Fiscus, Master Sergeant Michael Thomas, Specialist Brett Hershey, and Specialist Norman Schneider were killed instantly. Those 20 men, in June of 1966 and March of 2005, taught us and showed us what the price of liberty is. Unfortunately, over the last century, on 1,000 other days, hundreds of thousands of other American soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen have paid that same price. Millions more have broken their bodies and broken their minds, and unfortunately sometimes their spirits on foreign battlefields as well. In addition to that, you have the families, those that have to go on year after year, decade after decade, deprived of someone who meant everything in the world to them. In other cases, families are forced to become caregivers and deal with that, with what can be just a horrendous workload day in and day out, 24 hours a day for the rest of their life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the price of liberty. Unfortunately, though, it's not the only price of liberty. There's a more subtle price of liberty, and I'm afraid that it's a debt that far too many in our country have forgotten and are neglecting. You see, liberty requires constant attention. Government, by its very nature, is going to creep, it's going to grow, it's going to expand. Unless we, the people, apply a force against that and keep government within its proper bounds, then we will lose the liberty that so many have given everything for. Not to a gun, not to a bayonet, not to a bomb, but to benign neglect. Ladies and gentlemen, the price of liberty is constant. It is with us always, and it is a price that requires work and effort and vigilance and diligence from each and every one of us. Therefore, I challenge you to wake up, to pay attention. Help your neighbors, help your families, help your friends, because we need them too. Those folks in the recon platoon of the 2nd and 28th Infantry Battalion, those folks from Phoenix 3 gave all of their tomorrows so that we could be here today. We must honor that sacrifice by providing the diligence that they can no longer show on our behalf. Thank you very much.